Most people, when they hear the word ceasefire, hear the word peace. That is the assumption embedded in the language itself. A ceasefire stops the firing, it halts the killing. It gives civilians a moment to breathe and diplomats a moment to claim victory. The international community celebrates. Aid flows in, reconstruction begins, and the world moves on to the next crisis. But that framing misses what a ceasefire actually is, structurally, historically, and systemically. A ceasefire is not a resolution. It is a pause button pressed on a system that is still running. The pressures that created the conflict do not disappear when the guns go quiet. The grievances do not dissolve. The resource competitions do not end. The power vacuums do not fill themselves. What a ceasefire actually does, in most cases, is freeze a system at its most unstable point, and then allow every party involved to rearm, regroup, and reposition for the next round. You know what is strange? The ceasefires that are celebrated most loudly are often the ones that make the next war most likely. And that pattern is not accidental, it is structural. So what does that actually mean? It means the question worth asking is not whether a ceasefire will happen. At this point, the diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian pressures are significant enough that some form of pause is increasingly plausible in multiple active conflict zones. The more important question is what kind of system a ceasefire leaves behind, and whether that system contains the conditions for stability or the architecture for escalation. What happens in the months after the guns go quiet? Who controls what territory? Which political factions gain legitimacy? Which external powers entrench their influence? Which grievances go unaddressed? And critically, which parties use the ceasefire not as a foundation for peace, but as a window for preparation? These are the questions that determine whether a ceasefire is a beginning or an intermission. To understand why ceasefires so frequently fail to produce lasting peace, it helps to understand where the modern ceasefire framework came from and what it was designed to do. The contemporary architecture of internationally brokered ceasefires emerged largely from the post-World War II order, a system designed around the assumption that great powers could manage regional conflicts through negotiation, that sovereignty norms would constrain aggressive actors, and that international institutions could provide neutral ground for de-escalation. The ceasefire, in this framework, was designed as a tool for cooling overheated conflicts long enough for political solutions to emerge. That framework assumed a relatively stable bipolar or unipolar international order, in which one or two dominant powers could enforce agreements and guarantee compliance. It assumed that the parties to a conflict had a shared interest in not escalating beyond a certain threshold, and it assumed that the root causes of conflict, territorial, political, economic, could eventually be addressed through negotiation. Those assumptions have been under pressure for some time, but they have not yet been replaced with anything coherent. Here is how the ceasefire system actually works in practice. A conflict reaches a point of military or political exhaustion, not necessarily resolution, but exhaustion. One or more external powers determine that continued fighting no longer serves their strategic interests, or that the reputational and economic costs of the conflict are becoming too high. Diplomatic pressure intensifies. Back-channel negotiations begin. A framework is agreed upon, usually vague enough that both sides can claim partial victory. The ceasefire is announced. The international community moves quickly to solidify it, knowing that the window is narrow. Humanitarian aid is mobilized, which provides economic incentive for compliance. International monitors are deployed, though usually without meaningful enforcement capacity. Reconstruction funding is promised, which creates political incentive for at least temporary cooperation. But here is the internal logic that makes this system structurally fragile. The ceasefire does not address the underlying distribution of power. It freezes a territorial and political map that reflects the military situation at the moment of the pause, not a stable or legitimate long-term equilibrium. Whichever party feels it was winning will believe it surrendered an advantage. Whichever party feels it was losing will treat the ceasefire as a recovery period. This creates a feedback loop. Both sides use the ceasefire to rebuild military capacity. External powers use the period of relative quiet to deepen their influence and entrench their proxies. Political hardliners on all sides frame the pause as temporary and use it to consolidate domestic power, and the institutions tasked with converting the ceasefire into a political settlement, typically underfunded, understaffed, and operating without enforcement authority, find themselves racing against a clock they cannot see. It is worth pausing on the historical record because the numbers are instructive. Since 1945, there have been well over 200 significant armed conflicts. Roughly 60% of civil wars that end in some form of negotiated ceasefire or peace agreement see renewed armed conflict within 5 years. In conflicts involving external power competition, where regional or global powers have strategic interest in the outcome, that figure is considerably higher. The pattern is not an exception. It is the norm. Consider the broader arc. The Oslo Accords produced a framework celebrated globally, and within a decade, the situation had deteriorated into renewed cycles of violence. The Dayton Agreement ended the Bosnian War, but created a constitutional structure so fragile that it still generates institutional paralysis 3 decades later. The various ceasefire agreements in Libya since 2011 have totaled at least 6 major internationally brokered pauses, none of which produced political consolidation. South Sudan signed a peace deal in 2018 widely described as a breakthrough, and the country returned to large-scale violence within 4 years. These are not stories about failed diplomacy in the narrow sense. They are stories about what happens when the ceasefire mechanism is applied to systems that it was not designed to stabilize. But something has changed, and that change is what makes the current moment particularly consequential. The post-Cold War assumption was that the United States, as the dominant unipolar power, could act as the ultimate guarantor of ceasefire agreements. That guarantee, even when implicit, created a credibility backstop. Parties that violated agreements risked American pressure, economic consequences, and potential military response. That asymmetry of power, however imperfectly applied, provided structural weight to diplomatic frameworks. That backstop is now contested in ways it was not 20 years ago. The rise of China as a strategic competitor, the reassertion of Russian power in Eurasia, the growing influence of regional powers with divergent interests in the Middle East, the Sahel, and Southeast Asia. These shifts mean that ceasefire agreements are now reached in an environment of multipolarity without multilateral enforcement. Several major powers can now effectively underwrite the parties they support regardless of international pressure. The result is that ceasefires increasingly reflect the interests of competing external sponsors rather than the conditions needed for sustainable peace. At the same time, the domestic political economies of conflict have shifted. Non-state actors, armed groups, paramilitaries, criminal networks that have merged with political factions are now central players in most active conflicts. These actors frequently benefit economically from continued instability. For them, a ceasefire is not a path to peace. It is a moment to consolidate revenue streams, expand territorial control, and position for the next phase. They do not sign agreements in good faith because good faith is not their operating logic. They sign agreements that serve their interests and resume when those interests change. The pressures that push toward a ceasefire and the pressures that push toward renewed conflict are not separate forces. They interact. And that interaction is what makes the system so difficult to stabilize. On the economic dimension, international pressure for ceasefires often intensifies when commodity markets are disrupted, when refugee flows generate political costs for neighboring states, or when reconstruction contracts become attractive enough that external powers prefer stability. But those same economic incentives do not disappear in the post-ceasefire period. Reconstruction funding creates patronage networks. Commodity access remains contested. The economic geography of the conflict, who controls which resources, ports, transit corridors, reshapes the political map in ways that generate new competition. On the political dimension, ceasefires frequently produce legitimacy crises. The parties that agree to pause fighting must justify that decision to their own constituencies. Hardline factions use ceasefire agreements as evidence of betrayal. Moderate political leaders who stake their credibility on peace frameworks find themselves vulnerable when those frameworks produce ambiguous outcomes. The political pressure to demonstrate strength frequently overrides the structural incentives for restraint. On the military dimension, the period after a ceasefire is typically characterized by accelerated external arms flows. Sponsors on all sides use the window to improve the military positioning of their proxies. New weapons systems are introduced, training intensifies, intelligence networks deepen. By the time political negotiations stall, as they almost always do, the military capacity of all parties is significantly higher than it was when the ceasefire was signed. These dynamics, economic competition, political legitimacy pressure, and military buildup, do not operate independently. They reinforce each other. The economic competition generates political pressure. The political pressure generates military preparation. The military preparation changes the calculus for resumed conflict. These are not separate problems. They are the same problem expressing itself across different domains simultaneously. When a ceasefire is reached without a genuine political settlement, it creates a frozen conflict, a situation in which no party has enough power to achieve its objectives militarily, but no party has enough political incentive to accept the compromises necessary for resolution. Frozen conflicts are not neutral. They are dynamic systems that generate consequences continuously. Populations in frozen conflict zones face prolonged displacement, economic deprivation, and institutional collapse. The absence of war is not the presence of stability. Young populations growing up in post-ceasefire environments with no economic opportunity, no functioning institutions, and no political horizon are not populations that are becoming more moderate. They are populations in which the next generation of combatants is being shaped. External powers locked into supporting their proxies face increasing costs with decreasing returns, but they cannot easily withdraw without signaling weakness or conceding strategic position to rivals. So they continue to invest, not because they expect to win, but because they cannot afford to lose. This creates a dynamic in which the conflict becomes self-sustaining through external sponsorship, even when none of the primary sponsors actually want escalation. The international institutions tasked with managing these situations, the United Nations, regional bodies, diplomatic frameworks, find their credibility eroded by each failed ceasefire. The more agreements collapse, the harder it becomes to negotiate the next one. The system that was designed to de-escalate conflicts is gradually losing its capacity to do so. There are two broad paths forward from the current moment. In the first path, a ceasefire produces a genuine, if limited, political process. External powers with competing interests reach a secondary level accommodation, not a grand bargain, but a shared understanding that the costs of continued conflict are not worth the marginal gains. A political framework emerges that is imperfect but inclusive enough to provide competing factions with a stake in stability. Economic reconstruction creates constituencies for peace. Institutions slowly rebuild. The conflict does not end. It transforms gradually into a political competition conducted without large-scale violence. This path is not common, but it is not impossible. It requires sustained external pressure, genuine internal political will, and a level of international coordination that is difficult to achieve but not unprecedented. In the second path, the ceasefire holds for a period sufficient for all parties to rearm and reposition. The political process stalls, as it almost certainly will, without structural incentives for compromise. Hardline factions on all sides consolidate domestic power. External sponsors deepen their military commitments. A triggering event, an assassination, a territorial violation, an economic shock provides the pretext for resumed hostilities. The next conflict begins with higher military capacity on all sides, a more fractured political landscape, a more exhausted civilian population, and a weaker international institutional framework. It is longer, more destructive, and harder to stop than the one that preceded it. The historical evidence suggests the second path is significantly more likely than the first. Not because peace is impossible, but because the systems that generate conflict are more robust than the systems designed to prevent it. This is not just a story about ceasefires. It is a story about what happens when the tools used to manage a problem are not adequate to the structural forces generating it. The ceasefire framework was designed for a world in which conflicts had defined endpoints, in which great powers could enforce agreements, and in which the root causes of conflict could eventually be addressed through negotiation. That world has not existed for some time. What exists instead is a world of competing power centers, non-state actors with autonomous interests, and conflicts that are simultaneously local, regional, and global in their drivers and dynamics. In that world, a ceasefire is often the worst possible outcome. Not because it stops the killing, which it does, at least temporarily, but because it creates the illusion of progress while the structural conditions for renewed conflict deepen. It satisfies the political need for a solution without producing one. It allows external powers to claim success while continuing to arm their proxies. It gives populations hope while delivering them back to the same unstable equilibrium that generated the conflict in the first place. The question worth sitting with is not whether the next ceasefire will hold. Most of them do, for a while. The question is what kind of system it leaves behind, and whether anyone with the capacity to change that system has the will to try. That question does not have a comfortable answer, and perhaps that discomfort is exactly where any serious analysis of these conflicts has to begin.